Thank you, and good evening, and welcome. And I'm delighted to be here in conversation with Jason about this really interesting book. It's really an epic book, reported over 3 decades with one family in the Philippines. It begins in 1987 with you renting a spot on the floor from a woman in the Manila slums, and it ends in 2015 in a suburb of Houston with her daughter who is raising 3 children there, and in a new 4-bedroom house that you say the garage there in their house in the Houston suburbs was bigger than this shanty in the slums where the family started out. So it's the evolution, I think, of not only their material standard of living, but it's an odyssey that captures changes on many levels, and you get into the psychology of the characters and their relationships with each other, and then at the same time all these societal and political and technological developments that affect their migration path and their lives. And I really appreciate the nuance and the texture that you capture in this story. It's really a riveting story, and it can also help us understand some of these bigger issues around migration and the bigger forces that are propelling people from places like the Philippines to places like the United States, but a lot of other countries as well. As somebody who's covered immigration myself for almost 2 decades, I really tip my hat to your ability to weave these things together so seamlessly and to explain immigration in a way that feels really clear and really personal. So it's a great read, and I think it's a really useful book. And I wanted to start by asking you about this family, the Comodas family, and how and when you first met them, and who they are and what was going on in their lives.
Wow, thank you for the very generous introduction. Appreciate that. 30 years ago, I was a young reporter living in Manila, and I had an interest in shantytowns, the scrapwood mazes that cover a third of the city of Manila and much of the developing world. I called the Philippines' most famous nun, a woman named Sister Christine Tan, who lived and worked in a slum called Leverisa. I didn't say it at the time, but I was hoping I could move in. She was a friend of the new president, Cory Aquino, and very busy on a commission that was writing a new constitution. She wasn't very happy to hear from me. She snarled into the phone, "Call me back in a few months." Hoping to get a quicker audience, I told her I'd been working with another nun in her order. And discovered they weren't friends. She said, well, that's a mistake. Come see me tomorrow morning, 8 o'clock, in front of the Manila Zoo. So I showed up, and the first thing she says is, "Are you CIA?" "Well, you wouldn't tell me if you were, would you?" And then she goes on to explain that living with a Leverisa family won't work. The poor, she said, are magnificent people, unlike the rich. But Americans need toilets. Most people in Leverisa don't have them. They'd feel a need to cook me expensive food. I'd be a burden. And she went on to talk about how she didn't like the American military bases in the Philippines, and she didn't like American corporations. And then she waved her hand above her head like this, and she said, that's all up here. We need to do more to build relationships between the people of the first and the third world. If you come back in a few days, I'll see what I can do. So I came back a few days later thinking she would have used the time in between to screen a family, approach someone and see if they'd be willing to take in a boarder. And instead, she grabbed me and led me through the alleys and auctioned me off on the spot. She came to the first person she knew in the alley, and I knew just enough Tagalog to know that the woman was horrified. "No, sister, it's not possible." And so was the second woman, and the third person she saw was just struck mute. At which point, Sister Christine was out of patience, and she said, "If you don't want him, pass him on to someone else, and don't cook him anything special. If he gets sick, too bad." And she left me there staring at this. I don't know who was more scared, me or the woman. Her name was Tita. And we drew a crowd. There wasn't a lot of entertainment in the slum area we were at. People started shouting questions. Ask him if he eats rice. Ask him if he wants to marry a Filipina. And Tita stalled for about 2 hours. And at the end of it, she gave in to what she took to be Sister Christine's request and said I could move in and sleep on her floor. I did. Her husband was away so I went there because I was interested in poverty, not migration. But migration was how the family survived. Her husband was a guest worker in Saudi Arabia. She was home raising 5 kids on the money he sent back. We stayed in touch, and then all 5 of those kids grew up to become overseas workers like their father. And the one I was closest to, Rosalie, the middle child, became a nurse and wound up eventually in Texas. So she was a 15-year-old schoolgirl when I met her. She's now a 48-year-old mother of 3 who's been in the States now for 7 years and lives in Houston.
So that's
And
really
the book
her
tells
whole lifetime.
Right, so the book covers 3 generations of immigration. Her
Yeah.
father's experiences in Saudi Arabia, that generation, hers in both the Persian Gulf and the U.S., and then her children coming to the States as young children.
So that migration story is a big part of the family story and of the Philippine story. And you have a whole kind of like family tree in here that says, you know, all of the aunts and uncles who went overseas for work.
Which started as her father's act of desperation, became the family's way of life. Tita is one of 11 siblings. In her generation, 9 went abroad or had siblings who did. And now there's a second generation of 40-something cousins, and 25 of them, I think, are abroad.
Wow.
So there's dozens of people in the family who've had worked overseas, mostly in the Persian Gulf, but there are people in Canada and the United States, on cruise ships, all across the world.
And you kind of weave their story together with these larger stories about immigration, and you trace the departure of her father to the part of the history of the Philippines and its colonial past, and then things like a population explosion that has to do with better sanitation. I mean, you point out that there were not toilets in, sort of plumbing and sewage treatment and so forth, but that generally, increasing hygiene and sanitation and so forth led to a population explosion in the 20th century.
Yeah, the population of the Philippines rose 5-fold in the second half of the 20th century, and people were being pushed off the farms and came to the cities, had no place to stay. There were huge slums and excess labor. Not enough. The Philippines couldn't generate enough jobs, and Marcos, the President Ferdinand Marcos, the longtime Philippine dictator, spotted an opportunity when the Arab oil embargo in 1973 quadrupled the price of oil. Suddenly, the Persian Gulf had more money than it could do anything with, and the Philippines had all the workers and no jobs. Saudi Arabia had money and no workers, and a match was made, and Marcos started arranging for Filipinos to get work in Saudi Arabia. Most countries, when you go abroad. The government has nothing to do with it. But in the Philippines is a place that does more than any other country to market overseas workers and send them abroad.
Interesting piece of it is that's really concerted governmental push. And I think the out-migration is not dissimilar in other ways from other developing countries and countries that have that history of colonialism and economies that aren't supporting the workforce, not creating jobs for that workforce. Is there you talk some about remittances and how that is lifeblood for this family, but also for the country, and that's why the Philippine government was so strongly supporting that kind of migration. Does it feel like there's a cop-out there in terms of the country's ability to create its own
Let me tell you the
jobs?
story of Emet first going abroad.
Okay.
When he went so he was a pool maintenance man in Manila, and his eldest daughter, Rosalie's big sister, was born with a congenital heart defect that turned her lips blue and her fingernails black, and she was chronically sick. And Emet, a very religious man, got down on his knees and asked God, either take her or let me have her. Put her out of her misery, or heal her, Lord. God answered in a mysterious way. A few days later, he got a job offer in Saudi Arabia to do the exact same work he was doing in Manila at 10 times the wage. So he went from $50 a month in the Philippines to $500 a month in Saudi Arabia, allowed him to put in a new roof on the house and to buy Rowena medicine. So You know,
So
it may have saved her life.
Yeah. But as far as the country as a whole, I mean, is it a sort of an abdication of responsibility to build the economy domestically? And
You know, when I first went to the Philippines, I thought I would find a nationalist faction that had that point of view. It essentially doesn't exist. There really is no opposition to migration in the Philippines. It's just become that ingrained in the culture. When Rosalie finished nursing school and took her first job overseas, I thought, poor Rosalie, she has to go abroad. And then I realized from her perspective, it was, lucky Rosalie, I get to go abroad. You know, it's not all the poor who have the opportunity. It takes money, it takes resources, it takes connections.
Right.
It's the most fortunate of the unfortunate who get to go, and that's the category that Rosalie was in.
so you, after that initial stay with the family, you returned like 19, 20 years later to
Yes.
report on her migration, on what there.
I left the Philippines in 1987 after living with the family for 8 months. We had grown close, but I didn't know if I would ever see him again, you know? None of us could know if we'd ever see each other again. And they were great at staying in touch, better than I was, I'd have to say. Tita, the mother, was a wonderful letter writer. In fact, my mother recently died, and I found letters in her house that Tita had written when I was staying there, assuring her, "Don't worry, your son's okay." My mom's name was Joan. She wrote letters to "Dear Mommy Joanne, your son is fine." So we stayed in touch for really 20 years without seeing each other again, and then I went back to the Philippines to write a piece for the New York Times Magazine about migration and the culture of migration in the Philippines. My assignment was to write about how migration had affected Philippine culture, and I worried initially it would be too hard a story for an outsider to grasp, too subtle, you know, how something affects the culture. And I landed and rode past the Philippine Central Bank on my way to the hotel where the year's remittance tally was strung up in Christmas lights, 10 stories high. So it wasn't a subtle story. I mean, migration is to the Philippines what cars were to Detroit. You know, it's the civil religion. You know, it's just the papers have a dozen stories a day about migration.
So Rosalie was 15 when you first met her, and then when you went back, she was a nurse, and she was already off in
So she became she made the leap
Middle
from the
East.
slums to nursing school with her father's remittances. She would never have made it without that. And she wound up as a nurse, first in Saudi Arabia and later in Abu Dhabi. All the while hoping to get to the States. And I was about to give up after she had an 8-year wait, was about to give up, and when a hurricane finally hit Galveston, Texas, and destroyed the local hospital, they couldn't attract enough nurses to come back to the island, and they brought in 24 nurses, so Rosalie had her chance.
And that's how she got to the U.S.
2012, right.
But her first trip abroad was to Saudi Arabia.
She did two contracts, two-year contracts in Saudi Arabia. She met another Filipino. They courted secretly to avoid the religious police, got married back in the Philippines. She had a daughter, then went to Abu Dhabi, had a daughter and a son. The kids were mostly in the Philippines, and the mother and father were in Abu Dhabi, so you had like an 8-year period of separation between the parents and the kids.
That's a really intense piece of this, I think, is just that leaving one's children back home or with aunties or grandmas and I think maybe hard for some of us in this country to kind of grasp like what could be worth it materially to not to raise your own children or not to see them grow up. And talk about that a little bit, about sort of what those decisions were like for Rosalie and others that you knew, because that's
so the first generation of migrants went abroad were mostly men, in part because the work was generally in Saudi Arabia was generally construction work. They were building roads and airports and hospitals. And by the time Rosalie went, 3/4 of the new migrants were women. Migration feminized because the work did. Once they built the hospitals, they needed nurses to run them, and once they built the malls, they needed retail clerks. This happened all over the world, so you have not to the same extent, but a similar increase in the number of women who are going abroad as breadwinners. one of the impacts that has is it separates them from their children. That can play out in a lot of different ways depending on how good the care is that's left behind and how much money they make abroad and whether they're, the money they make up can compensate for the absence of the parents. Rosalie was endlessly torn about being away from her kids.
And I mean, just that idea that money can compensate for the absence of the parents. How is that possible? Is it? There's
Family
extended
separation.
families.
Family separation sounds awful, but poverty's awful too. I mean, you have kids who aren't eating. So if the kids are in a stable setting with grandparents who love them, or aunts and uncles, and the mom is able to provide for better food, better health care, better education, the kids could wind up better than they would be sitting in poverty, as Emet's kids were. Sometimes the
right.
fathers stay behind, sometimes they don't.
So tell a little bit more about like this whole issue of remittances and what it meant for this family. And
Well, Tita had a sixth grade education. She's the oldest of 11. Her younger sister wound up with a PhD that she got with remittances that her daughter sent back by being a housekeeper on a cruise ship, by cleaning cruise ship cabins. So one of the ways in which you see the mark of remittances is just soaring education rates. The hope initially was as education rises, the economy would develop and people would have work at home, but it's become a kind of cycle where people go abroad to pay for their kids' education, and the education then enables the kids to go abroad.
too.
Yeah.
And you said
One place you see, let me give you another example of remittances. So Tita grew up on this farm. She moved to the slums, lived there for 30 years, went back to the farm towards the end of her life. When you visit the farm, there are about 13 houses in a semicircle. And it's like an ocular form of carbon dating. You can tell how long each resident worked abroad just by looking at the house. The guy who went just for a couple years lives in a brick home, a cement block home, no paint and no windows. The guy did 10 years, has a second kitchen in the back. And Tita has the crown jewel of the compound, a pink 3-bedroom pink bungalow with a private water tank and foam marble floors, built by Rosalie with her money that she sent back from Abu Dhabi. I mean, this whole family, Tita, as I said, was one of 11 kids. They grew up in a thatched hut there, and now there are 13 houses on this farm, and all of them hanging with their children's diplomas. So it's made a profound. The money those families earned abroad has made a profound difference in their life. The title of the book, "A Good Provider is One Who Leaves," comes from Tita's sister, who was living in a thatched hut and watching her siblings come back from abroad, build cement block homes. And she turned to her husband and said,
what about you?
She wanted one too. She told her husband, "You need to go abroad. You need to go to Saudi Arabia. A good provider is one who leaves." It's easy for us to say, "Gee, what a terrible thing that being away from their kids or being away from their spouses." But we have to remember, poverty is pretty awful too, and those are decisions that everybody makes one by one. So they're hard decisions.
But it is, right, it's those individual decisions that make up this sort of larger international movements of these flows of people. But getting to the United States was Rosalie's real, like that was sort of the goal that was hanging out there, but it took a long time.
As it is for almost every Filipino nurse. I went to a Filipino nursing graduation a few years ago and asked the dean what share of the nurses were trying to go to the U.S. And she said 110%.
Wow.
I mean,
Because
people go
the
to
pay is
people
better,
go to
because
the nursing school in order to migrate. I mean, it's not that it's a side effect. It's the reason most people go in the Philippines.
But it took a long time. Partly that sort of tells us something about the bottlenecks in the legal immigration system in the U.S. And maybe you can say something about that. But also then, like, once they got here, sort of what happened? Like, how did it change?
You know,
her life, her
Rosalie,
family's life.
she's an unusual protagonist for the book, because if a journalist like you or me walked into a room and said, "I'm going to write a book about a migrant," you wouldn't like look in the room and pick Rosalie. She's very shy. She's kind of self-doubting. She's not very articulate. She wouldn't have been the one you would have thought would get out of the slum.
The
There were other
go-getter.
people who had more ambition, had better grades, but she just had this quiet resilience, and she just kept, and a deep faith, and she kept unplugging and kept unplugging. So she failed the nursing test to the U.S. several times. She failed the English test 5 times. And she finally got her visa, or she finally qualified for a visa, and there was a visa shortage. She had to wait a couple more years. When she got the visa, then the Great Recession hit, and the jobs were, she just kept pushing and pushing for 20 years until she finally got the opportunity to come to Texas. And she'd spent half her life hoping to get to the United States, and she had it up there, an idealized vision. Like, she came expecting Disney World, and she landed in Galveston, Texas, which is a struggling blue-collar community that had been hit by this hurricane with Katrina-like consequences. 1/6 of the island never came back, and she got very homesick and depressed for the first 6 months or so.
And do you think that was even more sort of glaring because it had been built up to something that was so
Absolutely
idealized?
Oh yeah. One of the, so she's part of a group of 20 nurses. They had to stay in Galveston for 2 years, and then they were free to move anywhere. One of them said when she finished her contract in Galveston, she was going to move to the United States.
That Galveston was not the United States.
This wasn't the United States that she'd had in her mind, right?
Uh-huh. Yeah. So, but then I think another thing that coming to the U.S. enabled that wasn't so easy when she was in the Middle East was to have her family together.
So she came, for the first 6 months, she was by herself, and that added to her loneliness. And her English was probably the weakest of the 20 nurses who came. We got together. I've met her in Manila, and we flew together to Texas. And we got to Galveston. The apartment manager said, we should eat at a little hole in the wall. And Rosalie got very alarmed and leaned over to me and said, how are we going to eat in the hole in the wall? The hole in the wall served poor boys. She wanted to know why I didn't serve poor girls. She was
idioms.
She didn't know the difference. She couldn't figure out the difference between Hallmark and Walmart. She was just kind of lost. She really was. I caught her crying one day, just wanting to go back. She had lived abroad for all these years, but always in a cocoon of Filipinos. There were so many Filipinos in Abu Dhabi. They do mass in Tagalog, and when she got to the U.S., she was really isolated. Yeah, and then the kids came, and her husband came, and things slowly turned a corner.
And actually, just your description of, that Filipino community in the Middle East when she first got there, there was a little passage here that I wanted to read just about the way that migrants can depend so much on friends and family. You say, networks drive migration as surely as do planes or ships. People go where they know someone. Networks plant the thought of leaving. They offer the migrant a couch to sleep on and word of the job opening. In economic terms, they reduce the costs and risks of moving and increase the rewards. As a means of speeding people across the globe, networks are formidable, but as a set of relationships to manage, they're a challenge. The relative on the couch can be a burden. In moving to Abu Dhabi, Rosalie blazed a trail. What followed in a rush of siblings and cousins was a complicated story of solidarity and conflict. And let's jump back there for a minute because there's this complexity of, how do people navigate those personal relationships?
So Rosalie was the first of the family to get to Abu Dhabi. Most of the family had been in Saudi. Abu Dhabi is a freer place. You can practice your religion, and the jobs pay better. So she was the sort of pioneer. She brought 3 of her 4 siblings with her. Then she started bringing cousins. At one point, I think she had 12 people maybe living in her 2-bedroom apartment in Abu Dhabi. They called it the Philippine Embassy. And her husband, so they were all her family. And her husband is suddenly kind of outnumbered by Rosalie's family. And then they all were coming over and getting jobs, and he was unemployed. And they start gossiping about him. Why is he laying around all day? Why isn't he? So a lot of tension rose in the house, and Rosalie was really caught between her husband and her family, and her siblings. And that's a tough place for anybody to be, and especially for somebody who values family relationships as much as she did. I think it's characteristic of a larger immigration dynamic, and we tend to think of networks as being wholly positive, because they do provide all these rewards.
The couch to sleep on.
Yeah, they
right.
move people around the world, and they're a social safety net. But they also can be engender a lot of conflicts, and eventually, that, as it did in Rosalie's household, there was a big fight, and Rosalie eventually had to ask her siblings to leave in order to patch up her marriage.
And she did, but then when she came to the U.S., she wasn't even quite sure that her husband was gonna come.
They had some hard years together in Abu Dhabi, and she couldn't have the kids in the U.S. She felt like she couldn't legally. She could have the kids in the U.S., but she felt like she couldn't manage the kids in the U.S. if her husband didn't come. Her husband came, the kids came, and then the new dynamic was they weren't just learning how to live in a new country, but they were learning how to live together, period, because they hadn't done it. The
Right.
kids had mostly been with their aunts and their grandparents in the Philippines, so they were kind of strangers in a new country together.
Again. Yeah.
That's I think another dynamic people probably don't sufficiently appreciate about migration is after many years of maternal separation, these are tough relationships to manage again.
And then you also talk about the gender dynamics of, she was the breadwinner and he was the guy who...
Right, so there's 20 nurses who came together, mostly Filipino, to Texas. 19 were women. So you had 19 trailing men as trailing spouses, most of whom were experiencing some form of downward mobility, a loss of income, a loss of status. And there were a lot of battered male egos. I wasn't thinking about it, the last thing I was looking for was kind of gender conflict, but it was just so obvious in all these families that I came to realize how pervasive it was, not only in the Filipino community, but you see it in ethnographies of immigration more broadly, that, as you would think the empowerment of women or the as breadwinners would be a wholly positive thing for them because it would give them more economic power, but
and a voice in the family.
It's a complicated thing because to the extent it alienates the men, the women often kind of bend over backwards to try to accommodate the men, and it leads they want to keep the marriages and the families together, but that often requires a lot of hard compromises, as they did for Rosalie.
And what do you think
at the end when she buys the house, she puts her husband's name on the deed with hers, but takes out the mortgage by herself. So she's the breadwinner, she's got the debt, but she wants to honor his place in the family and puts his name. She was making compromises like that all throughout.
And I was just going to ask, and maybe that's an answer to it, but what do you think was sort of their secret sauce that made things work for them in terms of...
Rosalie really values family. She really wanted to stay married. She really wanted her marriage to work. And eventually her husband found work and felt better, I think, about what he was doing. So she... I'm thinking about the word feminist. In some ways, she's a very, very much a feminist because she worked her way across the world and brought her whole family, and she was the lead breadwinner for. And in other ways, she's very traditional. That there's no divorce in the Philippines, and
right?
There was none in her mind.
Not legal.
Legal, yeah. There is no divorce.
Interesting.
And she's very religious too. Yeah.
And when they got to the U.S., it was 2012.
Yes.
So Obama was president, but it feels like in this country there are these sort of ebbs and flows of how we think about immigration and immigrants. And, on the one hand, there's this storyline of, it's a nation of immigrants and, we celebrate our diversity and look at all those flags over there. And then on the other hand, there can be backlash and there can be fear of immigrants. And then post 9/11, there's fear of terrorists. And then, we have a a president now who launched his campaign talking about Mexicans as rapists, and so
At first, I thought Rosalie was not intersecting or not emblematic of the main narrative in the United States because she came legally. She's middle class. She's Asian, not Latino. And then I realized, as I got into her story, that actually she's more characteristic than I understood. Well, first of all, 70% of people who are here legally, as she was. But in the past 10 years, Asians have outnumbered Latinos among new migrants. The majority of new migrants have college educations. The majority live in the suburbs. So actually, I came to think of her as quite emblematic of a major American immigration narrative. It's the one left out of the president's Twitter feed, but it's a dominant one.
And did those sort of feelings about immigrants affect this family, or?
Not really. I kept wondering and looking for what effect the rise of Donald Trump would have on them. And Rosalie is, maybe it's the immigrants' politeness or wariness about criticizing the society their new society, but the only thing she would say about it is, I cannot judge what's in his heart. That's the only thing she said. There's a generational divide. The kids have said, I asked her as we were in the car, and then Christine, her oldest daughter, piped up from the back seat, "He's a racist." The kids, interestingly, have really imbibed an American notion of racial equality in a way that the parents' generation didn't particularly. At one point, Rosalie turned to her daughters. They were 9 and 11, and she said, "I really want you to marry a Filipino." This is kind of apropos of nothing.
They're
just
not
sitting in
ready
the living
for
room one day.
marriage, but yeah.
And that way he can go home to the Philippines with us. And Christine said, "Yeah, that's racist, Mommy." And then Laura said, "Yeah, it doesn't matter. It's the only thing that's important is what's in his heart." And she doubled down and said, "No, he's got to be Filipino so we can go home." And they doubled down and said, "No, it doesn't." And it was a real revealing moment, I think. That they've studied Rosa Parks and Harriet Tubman and Martin Luther King, and I think that notion of colorblindness is an important part of their life, whereas Rosalie wears her Filipino ethnicity as a part more of her identity, in
and
a way
she's
that just isn't for the kids.
reading news in Tagalog.
She gets all her news from Manila TV, yeah, absolutely, and Facebook, yeah.
And so you get some into this question of assimilation and sort of how she assimilates or doesn't, and then how her kids do. But
So can I tell you about Laura and Rosa Parks?
Yes.
All right. It's like Laura. So the two girls. Laura's the younger daughter. Christine, the older daughter, kind of assimilated to a vision of American society that she got from watching sitcoms on TV. If you know The Sweet Life of Zack and Cody, there's a character named London Tipton who's kind of based on Paris Hilton, sort of a ditzy tweener, and this was kind of Christine's model, and she started taking 100 selfies a day and posting them on Instagram accounts with names like Christine Cute, and went that direction. Kind of a teenage, a middle school diva. And her younger sister Laura was very studious, and was sitting when she first got to the United States, second grade. Her teacher told her that Rosa Parks was a hero, and she came. It was Black History Month. She came home and said she didn't think Rosa Parks could be a hero because she didn't listen to the policemen. This is a Filipino girl who's been taught to obey authority, and besides, she said everybody knows heroes wear capes, so she couldn't be a hero. A year later goes by. One day, Laura just pipes up at dinner and says, "I kind of agree with Rosa Parks." I said, "Well, tell me why." She said, "Well, she paid the same amount of money, and so it wasn't fair that she had to sit in the back. And then also, when the policeman made her get up, she didn't curse at him. She didn't say any bad words. So she kind of blended in. in her mind, Rosa Parks became like the civil rights hero who didn't curse. And it was a really interesting blending of like American values and Filipino values. So Filipino, she kept her emphasis on respect and deference and civility, and she got from American culture this notion of racial equality. And I just watched her do that again and again, like blend the two cultures together into something new and all her own. The thing that she really got out of American culture was the ability to ask questions. In the Philippines, nothing had encouraged her to ask questions. Filipino kids are sort of expected to respect their elders, not interrogate them. But American teachers loved questions, and Laura obliged them endlessly. Yeah. Is the Leaning Tower of Pisa going to fall? Is Galveston an empire? Do nurses have to be caring? Maybe I'll just be a doctor, she said.
And this, I mean, in our education system, that's the way you learn is, that kind of curiosity and inquisitiveness.
But nothing, we think sometimes of immigrants as being extraordinary people, as they often are, sort of board the ships, brave the ocean, come across the border. But I think immigration can have another effect on as well, of allowing ordinary people to do, for them, extraordinary things just because they're in a culture that values something in them that their previous culture didn't. And I think that's what happened for Laura in America. There was America valued her curiosity in a way that Philippine culture didn't.
Okay.
And she blossomed as a result. And it was great to watch.
And so, because they were born in the Philippines, but came of age here.
They were 9, 7, and 5 when they got here. Yeah.
And did you see sort of with their emergence? I guess just
they
I'm
arrived
curious about
speaking very little English, and Rosalie was adamant that they were going to retain their Tagalog, and they were only going to speak Tagalog at home, and that lasted about 15 minutes. I mean, American culture just came pouring in. TV, phone, school, they were quickly fluent, and they've now lost their ability to speak Tagalog. And all the Americanization that Rosalie vowed would never happened immediately. I have to smile when I hear people saying that the immigrants don't assimilate anymore. They don't learn English. They don't blend in. I mean, it happens. They in 3 years they achieved a degree of integration into the culture that used to take 3 generations.
Really?
With fluent English, place on the honor roll, house in the suburbs.
not just the kids, but the parents too.
The whole family,
yeah. And why do you think it was so much faster than prior generations?
There's a couple of things I think that. Well, for one, that they're being educated. She had a solid middle class job. She came knowing some English. And the kids came kind of pre-assimilated in a way. They knew American culture just from watching TV.
And
they couldn't really speak English, but they knew Tom and Jerry. I mean, they sometimes critics of immigration talk about that the gulf between our society now and foreign and the developing world is larger than it was 100 years ago when the Ellis Island generation came. I really don't think that's true. I think American culture is, by and large, conquered the world, and people come already attuned in certain ways to American life.
It has to do with technology and social media and communications. I'm really interested in your reporting process. So this started with magazine writing, I guess, and you're a newspaper reporter, but at some point you made a decision, like there's a book here, and I'm just curious, how did you know this was a book, and
really
why
started
you wanted to write it?
It really started with a youthful thought about getting out of journalism, because when I first went to the Philippines, I'd been a reporter for about 4 years, mostly writing about poverty issues in the United States, and I was confronting that dilemma that most journalists face at some point or other about whether I just wanted to be a pure observer or whether I wanted to be involved more directly. And I thought maybe I might want to be a doctor and treat poor people. So I took my time in the Philippines to come think about that question. And I moved into the slum area, and what I found myself doing was taking, not starting a clinic, but was taking notes. I just naturally reverted back to. I started keeping a journal about Tita and her daily life and her faith and how she felt about her husband being gone and how she felt about her kids and what she hoped for her future. And at one point, she was always asking me what I was writing. So I bought her a journal, not thinking she was going to actually use it, and she started taking notes about me. So we compared notes at one point. My journal says, I got up this morning and, oh my God, I looked down my plate. There was this big fish head staring up at me, and I had to choke it down. And Tita's begins, I went to the market this morning and bought Jason a fish head. He liked it. I'm so happy.
And so you showed each other what you had written.
So the reporting process started really not as a reporting process. I just
your observer.
I guess I was what an anthropologist would call a participant observer. I didn't have a job. Wasn't writing a story. I was just living there. And I had a lot of notes and kept taking notes on the family for 20 years. And then was when I went back to do the magazine story, I realized how emblematic they were of a process Overtake found across the world. The light bulb moment for me when I really understood the importance of migration and therefore the importance of their story was in discovering that remittances were, the money that migrants sent home were 3 times the world's foreign aid budgets combined. Migration is the world's anti-poverty program. So, sometimes people say poor people should do more to help themselves, and migrants do. So, I saw the global significance of their story, and that point I started to do
this
the story.
Is a book,
and to more deliberately take notes and think about a narrative.
Interesting.
But I was greatly aided by the fact that I had this long-standing relationship with them and trust. So it didn't. I wasn't approaching them as a stranger to write a book about them. I was approaching them as a friend of 20 years. Yeah.
I'd like to write a book, or I'd like to write an article, and did you presented that to them?
I did a story for the New York Times Magazine, and Rosalie was like the picture. So she was on the cover of the New York Times Magazine, and I think it made her feel validated or important. But, she thought about it a lot less than you would think. I mean, if you write about a figure in public life, you're going to get people quibbling about every word and rushing to the index to see how many times they're mentioned. For Rosalie, I think we were together so much that she really almost forgot I was writing a book. I mean, when the book finally came out, they all kind of looked up and said, "Oh, you're writing a book." I mean, obviously they knew I was writing a book the whole time, but it was like, "Oh yeah, you're writing a book." I forgot about that. Yeah.
Because you quote from her journal in here, and I mean, there's material that they had to share with you.
Oh, they were very open about sharing text messages, financial records. The school let me go to school with the kids. The hospital let me shadow Rosalie around the hospital. I mean, they were very, the family was extremely cooperative, and so were the institutions around them.
And then your role, and you said participant observer. I mean, your role, I don't know if maybe it didn't evolve into this because it didn't start as a journalistic relationship, but it was very different from a sort of repertorial distance. That you...
when I went to Texas, I stayed with them always. So I was there early in the morning. I was there late at night. We went grocery shopping. We did the dishes. I just hung out with them, and a lot of times my family. I live in Washington. I had to go to Texas, and my family would say, "Well, why are you going? What's going to happen?" I don't know what's going to happen. I'm just going to go
hang out
and see. And you would sometimes hang out a whole day, and you look at your notes and think nothing had happened. I have nothing to write about, and then suddenly somebody says something, and you catch a insight, and it can't be. And it could be Laura looking up from the dinner table and saying, I sort of agree with Rosa Parks. I mean, and sometimes when that happens, you don't realize the significance of it. You write it down, and then it's a month later when you're going through your
can
notes, you're
connect some
realizing,
dots.
oh, wait a minute, she was. I might have already forgotten about the Rosa Parks comment a year earlier, and then you put it together, and you start to have a narrative of a trajectory of her entrance into American society.
Well, and what a luxury to be able to spend that time to.
It was the most gratifying,
intensive reporting time.
Experience of my career. Yes, it was. It was luxury is a great way of putting it. Yeah, it was an honor.
Do you want to read a little bit for
Sure.
us?
There's a discussion in the book. The National Academy of Sciences put out hundreds of pages of look at the costs of immigration and the fiscal costs and whether immigrants add to or subtract from government budgets, and ran the numbers, cost-benefit analysis, 10 different ways. And I discussed it a little bit in the book. And I'm pleased to say that Rosalie is projected, her and her descendants are projected to increase government income by hundreds of thousands of dollars over the next
U.S.
75
government
years.
income.
Yeah, the amount of money she pays in taxes will exceed the amount she collects in benefits by hundreds of thousands of dollars. So that's the context.
Okay.
But cost-benefit analysis alone doesn't do her story justice. Rosalie's escape from Leverisa is a minor miracle. Migration was her vehicle of salvation. It delivered her from the living conditions of the 19th century. It respected her talent, rewarded her sweat, and enlarged her capacity for giving. It made her life deeper, fuller, and more filled with hope. It's great that migration helped her help others. It's also great that it helped her help herself. That her quest ended in Texas is something for Americans to cheer. It's good for your country to be the place people go to make dreams come true. The new house had what Rosalie wanted: laminate wood floors, a double-door fridge, premium cabinets, and a big tub where a nurse could soak her legs. The garage alone was larger than the house in Leverisa. Each of the kids had a separate room, but they were scared to sleep alone in a house so big. For months, they curled up beside Rosalie and Chris, Filipino style. When I asked Rosalie how the house compared with the hovel where we met, with the leaks, the rats, the heat, the stench, the crowds, she couldn't find the words. I couldn't either. Oh my God, she told the kids, big difference. Mommy didn't have it like this. Mommy grew up in a shanty. Christine looked up. What's a shanty, Mommy?
She didn't know. Interesting. Well, we have a few questions from the audience, and so I want to offer you a chance to answer some of those, and then we're going to open it up even further. As a journalist, how do you feel the narrative story of migration plays a role in impacting policy? And have we seen it be effective, or what more could it do?
Well, of course, as a journalist, I have some faith that a narrative shapes policy, but as a journalist for 30 years, 30 plus years, I know that the impact isn't always direct. I mean, lots of things shape policy. Stories can, but so do raw power. I think trying to change the narrative of immigration away from a relentless focus on just illegal immigration is a good thing, because most immigrants don't come illegally. I mean, the border crisis has just taken up so much oxygen in the debate. I mean, it's obviously an important story. We have to cover it. I think journalists are generally doing a great job, but it's overshadowed this much larger and, I think more hopeful story of immigration that Rosalie represents. So I think it's important to insert that kind of story into the bloodstream of policymaking.
Mm-hmm. And when we think of the border, we think of unauthorized immigration. There's there's been a bit of a shift in terms of a lot of people now coming and looking
Right,
for
you basically think of
asylum.
Latinos on the border,
Right.
fleeing violence or poverty in Central America, as opposed to a nurse coming from the Philippines
Right.
via the Middle East to provide health care for a hospital that couldn't find enough American nurses on their own. So it's a very different emphasis. I think it's really important that Rosalie was recruited because this hospital couldn't attract enough American nurses. It was offering bonuses of $5,000 and it couldn't get American nurses to stay. They just had better options than Galveston. They could go to Houston, which has world-renowned medical centers and is 45 minutes away. So Rosalie didn't come to take an American job. She came to fill a job that the hospital couldn't fill, and in doing so provided marvelous care for Texans, rich and poor. So that's a very different way of framing the story.
And I don't know, like, how much, I mean, as you say, her story, this family's story, is a story of legal migration. And I don't know how much you've paid attention to asylum issues or some of the debates around asylum. This is a question that says, what do you think those who are anti-immigration get wrong about economic hardship as a reason to seek asylum? And I mean, I don't know if you think that they get something wrong, but there are questions about, roots of migration and is an economic reason a basis for
one of the benefits of having lived with the family in the shantytown is I think I'm able to take readers on that journey that Rosalie herself has traveled. Sometimes when I'm giving book talks, I show a split screen of the shanty in Manila and the house in the suburbs of Houston. And when I see it, even I, having been in both places, sometimes still can't quite believe it. I've been covering poverty for 35 years. I've never seen a story of a poverty success story as profound, a transformation so fast. To see Rosalie come from that shanty and become a skilled American nurse who can save lives in the United States, it's just a reminder of how much human potential there is wasted or lost in the world. I mean, think about how many, you have 2 billion people living in shantytowns across the world and capable of the kind of growth that Rosalie had if they were given the chance. I mean, it's you can use words like poverty, came from poor circumstances, lived in the shanty, but if you haven't seen where she grew up and where she got, I think it's hard to feel the thrill of her achievement. And I share in it vicariously as an American. I feel it's good for me, it's good for my country that we helped make that happen. Makes me proud.
Here's a question about the Philippines. At the last Philippine elections, Duterte, the current president, received strong support from overseas workers. Can you speak about whether these workers develop politically or do they stay mostly conservative? Or just sort of how, what is their relationship to Philippine politics is maybe another way to ask that.
Yeah, that's a good question, and it's not one I'm particularly expert on. I think Rosalie and Chris have some sympathy for Duterte, and I don't understand why. But I understand that lots of overseas Filipinos do. And I'm sorry, I can't offer a lot of insight into it.
Like instilling order and
Tita, the mother, was an Aquino person, and the father, Emet, liked Marcos and said the Filipinos were hard-headed and needed that strong man to impose order. So that is a strain of Filipino political thought. I don't have any particular insight into it. Or no, any special insight into it.
Okay. And then I guess one more question of mine is just sort of what are the big takeaways that you've had and how the reporting maybe has changed you and how you see immigration unfolding in the U.S. today.
I've always been, I think, implicitly or instinctively pro-immigration, but seeing what immigration did for Rosalie, as I said before, just makes me proud to be an American. That proud to see that our country can attract that kind of faith and resilience and hope. That people of that kind of ambition want to come here, I think is a great thing. And I see more parallels in immigration, in today's immigration, parallels between today's immigration and past immigration than I did before I did the book. I think there's a lot of critics of immigration often say, well, it worked, it was fine in the Ellis Island years, but we're getting different kinds of immigrants now, or they're not as committed to Americanizing us. They don't really want to be here. They're transnationalists. They can Skype, so they don't settle in. They're not, first of all, there's all kinds of echoes of that existed in the past. The people in the Ellis Island years were saying that they weren't those immigrants weren't as good as the Germans who had come a half century earlier. And secondly, I just don't think it's true. I think today's immigrants, if anything, are learning English and integrating into the society at rates, if anything, exceed those of previous generations. So, as a poverty reporter, you don't always get to tell such a hopeful story. So I'm going to savor this one.
That's great. So that is all the time we have tonight. And on behalf of the World Affairs Council, I want to ask you to join me in thanking Jason for this really, really interesting discussion.
Thank you.